Okay, can you guys hear me? Good. Now, can you guys please tell me? I have a question for everyone. There's a question for you guys. What in the world is "Please excuse my dear Aunt Sally"? I heard it, and I'm supposed to know what this means. And I've heard it before, and I probably do know, but what is it? Oh. Oh, okay. PEMDAS. Okay. Parentheses, exponents, multiplication, division, addition, subtraction. Well, you're probably right. That makes sense, because I've heard it in the context of a math class. And one of my math teachers said, "Remember, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally." So that was Calc 2 or 3, by the way. Hmm. So okay, so that question's answered. I don't have to go and ask it anymore. What in the world do you think I should make the title for today? Whatever shows up in the chat box, within reason, I will make the title of the stream. No. That would be, I mean, that would be an awful lot. That'd be more appropriate, except for I think that if people wound up, I think if people wound up saying, or I wound up saying that, I could easily get myself in trouble again. And I'm actually not, believe it or not, I'm actually not. Hmm. No, there we go. That's going to be our title for today. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that, I'm just this. No, INTJs do not have an FE teddy bear. So with that said, summer vacation and splattered evening crack. Excellent. That is. need to change the size of the font just a little bit in order to there we go. That should do it. Alright. Well, we are 6 minutes into the third attempt at streaming. It's 4:24 a.m. I'm using that for the timestamp, just so that I can actually find this moment, so we can find something useful to talk about. And the useful thing I had to talk about, it had to do with the use of knowledge in society by Friedrich A. Hayek. It has to do with constructing a rational economic order. So, what is the problem we wish to solve when we try to construct a rational economic order? On certain familiar assumptions, the answer is simple enough. If we possess all the relevant information, if we can start out from a given system of preferences, and if we command complete knowledge of available means, the problem which remains is purely one of logic. That is, the answer to the question of what is the best use of the available means is implicit in our assumptions. The conditions which the solution of this optimum problem must satisfy have been fully worked out, and can be stated best in mathematical form. Put at their briefest, they are that the marginal rates of substitution between any two commodities or factors must be the same in all their different uses. This, however, is emphatically not the economic problem which society faces, and the economic calculus which we have developed to solve this logical problem, though an important step toward the solution of the economic problem of society, does not yet provide an answer to it. The reason for this is that the data from which the economic calculus starts are never for the whole society given to a single mind which could work out the implications, and can never be so given. So, the peculiar nature of the problem of a rational economic order is determined precisely by the fact that the knowledge of the circumstances of which we must make use never exists in concentrated or integrated form, but solely as the dispersed bits of incomplete and frequently contradictory knowledge, which all the separate individuals possess. The economic problem of society is thus not merely a problem of how to allocate given resources, if given is taken to mean given to a single mind which deliberately solves the problem set by these data. It is rather a problem of how to secure the best use of resources known to any of the members of society, for ends whose relative importance only those individuals know. Or, to put it briefly, it's a problem of the utilization of knowledge which is not given to anyone in its totality. The character of the fundamental problem has, I am afraid, been obscured rather than illuminated by many of the recent refinements of economic theory, particularly by many of the uses made of mathematics. Though the problem with which I want primarily to deal in this paper is the problem of a rational economic organization, I shall, in its course, be led again and again to point to its close connections with certain methodological questions. Many of the points I wish to make are indeed conclusions toward which diverse paths of reasoning have unexpectedly converged. But as I now see these problems, this is no accident. It seems to me that many of the current disputes with regard to both economic theory and economic policy have their common origin in a misconception about the nature of the economic problem of society. This misconception, in turn, is due to an erroneous transfer to social phenomena of the habits of thought we have developed in dealing with the phenomena of nature. In ordinary language, we describe by the word planning the complex of interrelated decisions about the allocation of our available resources. All economic activity is in this sense planning, and in any society in which many people collaborate, this planning, whoever does it, will in some measure have to be based on knowledge which, in the first instance is not given to the planner but to somebody else, which somehow will have to be conveyed to the planner. The various ways in which the knowledge on people base their plans is communicated to them is the crucial problem for any theory explaining the economic process, and the problem of what is the best way of utilizing knowledge initially dispersed among all the people is at least one of the main problems of economic policy, or of designing an efficient economic system. The answer to this question is closely connected with that other question which arises here, that of who is to do the planning. It's about this question that all the dispute about economic planning centers. This is not a dispute about whether planning is to be done or not. It's a dispute as to whether planning is to be done centrally by one authority for the whole economic system, or is to be divided among many individuals. Planning, in the specific sense in which the term is used in contemporary controversy, necessarily means central planning, direction of the whole economic system according to one unified plan. Competition, on the other hand, means decentralized planning by many separate persons. The halfway house between the two, about which many people talk but which few like, is when they see it as the delegation of planning to organized industries, or, in other words, monopoly, which is essentially what was done by the National Socialists. They went and found a way of fabricating the idea of individual property, but for all practical purposes, one couldn't do anything against the will of the government without showing up missing. Which of these systems is likely to be more efficient depends mainly on the question under which of them we can expect that fuller use will be made of the existing knowledge. And this, in turn, depends on whether we are more likely to succeed in putting at the disposal of a single central authority all the knowledge which ought to be used, but which is initially dispersed among many different individuals, or in conveying to the individuals such additional knowledge as they need in order to enable them to fit their plans with those of others. So I'm going to pause here. And copy the link that I'm dealing with right here for you guys to follow along with. Yes, it is. How did you guess? The central planning sucks. And interestingly, people and it's interesting that Gorbachev said, central planning works, the only problem is we never had a good plan. Like, what in the world is that supposed to mean? Central planning works, the only problem is that we've never had a good plan. Ah. Allah, did you wind up studying this on your own, or did you wind up doing this for a class? You see, if central planning were a thing, I don't know if I'd even be able to have my morning coffee. I don't even know if I'd be able to have my morning coffee. Okay, so if you live in Argentina and you're studying Hayek, what is it that people actually wind up thinking about him? Like, do they think that he's full of crap? Do they think that, oh, decentralized planning is good as long as I'm the one doing the planning for everyone else? Or like, what in the world are they, what are they thinking? I'm very interested in knowing. Haha! I'm going to read the entire piece, assuming that you went through the entire piece as well. But I'm very, very curious as to what it is that people actually think. Because I have this... perhaps it's not the most admirable tendency that whenever I wind up seeing something stupid, I generally tend to go and look at it and think, how could anybody believe this, and then just throw it aside, as opposed to actually engaging with the material to tell exactly in excruciating detail in every aspect how stupid something is. Bioengineering. Okay. Well, good. The rest study Marx. Oh boy. Oh yay. I wonder what makes Marx so compelling. I really do. I have absolutely no clue. I could go and rant about Marx, but the fact of the matter is, it's so asininely easy to hijack his... You mean you're biased toward the left? Yeah. It's so easy to hijack. It is so asininely easy to hijack Marxist philosophy and turn it into, to do what Lenin did. Ah, they train you to actually make money. You know that's evil, right? Making of the making of money. It's very, very evil. Money can't conceivably be anything other than evil. Ah. Except, of course, if it isn't. The thing about making money being evil, and I think that I'm really, really terrible at remembering who said things. I think it was Warren Buffett that said, economics isn't actually built on greed. It's built on envy. Yeah, producing value. And then having money as kind of a scorekeeping device. And inflation is a covert means of taking away people's points. Inflation sucks. Producing value is very important. Heck, it's the only way anybody actually does anything in a capitalist economy. If you're not producing value, if there isn't any safety net, whether it be government or church or private charity or whatever, yeah, built on envy. Yeah, if there aren't those things, well then you're kind of out of luck. You know, that's why people are concerned. Well, what if I'm sick and I can't work or something? I think it was Warren Buffett that I may be completely mistaken, but I think it was Warren Buffett that talked about how economics is built on envy. And the reason that is because, well, I'll give an example. And this might be a little bit extreme. I don't know if everyone has this view everywhere in the world, but I do recall a couple of years ago, there was kind of this Make Finland Great Again thing, except that wasn't what it was called. But there was this piece on the news where a bunch of people were interviewed as to what they would do to make the country better over here. And in this interview, when they were going and seeing what other people said and so on, there was this one Swedish artist dude who wound up saying that in Finland there's this attitude that if your neighbor comes and gets a nice car or something, the Finnish attitude is to want to destroy your neighbor's nice car, rather even than to get one for yourself. So, with this whole idea that, okay, my neighbor got a nice car, let's destroy it. It's so much about where do I rank in the system, as opposed to what is the absolute value of what I've actually done and what I have. If my ranking is all that matters, then it makes sense to chop the ladder off right above my head. And what else would Big Daddy government be there for? Right? Economic inequality is what people are fearful of, and they figure that if the Gini coefficient is too big, well, then things go bad. And if you guys are interested, look up Gini coefficient and apply it to wealth inequality. It basically describes how unevenly distributed something is in accordance with the Pareto distribution. Ah, lovely. Mr. Beers is being quite supportive. Clearly not envious. I mean, what does he have to be envious of? Anyhow, this idea that the ladder of success needs to be cut off right above my head really means that it puts a limit of productivity as to what it is that I can produce. And given that there are plenty of people in the world that are capable of producing way more than I do. Oh, tuberculosis. Aw. I'm sorry that he works at a think tank now, or at least I'm happy for the people there. Perfect, immaculately formed eyebrows. Shh, what you don't know is that I wind up, using the remnants of my toilet paper and a Q-tip to get them to all work that way. Yes, we're all competing. Well, we're also competing for serotonin in the short term, because we can get it, upon a source of dejection, our serotonin goes away and we feel defeated and get depressed and so on. I think this popular idea of wealth distribution, well, there is something to be said for it, that when wealth distribution becomes too unequal within a nearly homogeneous group. Hello, David. Within a pretty homogeneous group, resentment kicks in. Resentment and envy. And when there's enough resentment and envy, it doesn't matter how good the bottom people have it, they revolt. I mean, if you look and you see, okay, there are very few places in the developed world where there are few food shortages anymore. There are very few places in the developed world where there are food shortages anymore. But if you look, for instance, at the United States, there is practically no abject poverty in the United States, just due to the sheer amount of resources produced. If you somehow supplied limitless doses of serotonin and dopamine to everyone, I've thought about that, then nobody would accomplish anything. Nobody would accomplish a single thing if there was unlimited serotonin and dopamine. Most people would lose all motivation. Why do you think that druggies don't do anything? Or at least that's the stereotype. There's a reason. They've hijacked their serotonin and dopamine system. something that was intended to increase productivity. Trickle-down economics. Well, I'm not even sure what the term means anymore. What I can say about things trickling down is that if economic policy has any kind of an effect on a group, and that effect is good or bad, it will have downstream consequences. It will have downstream consequences. There are always downstream consequences. What happens if okay, so let's take for instance the idea that a corporation doesn't pay very much in taxes. Well, what does that mean? It means that they're going to be more competitive. They're going to be able to offer their products at lower prices, or the products and services. Whatever it is they bring to market, they will have less cost than somebody who has higher taxes. So, if there is a free market and the prices get too high, well then that encourages investment into that field. That encourages people to go and compete. And so naturally the price will wind up going down. Now if you go and you tax, that sends a wrong kind of a price signal, because in order to comply with the tax burden, you need to sell things, to pay higher taxes, to pay politicians and bureaucracies to enforce a money is artificially hampered by this portion that is regulation. I'm not saying that the economy shouldn't be regulated. I'm just saying that it tends to regulate itself over time, and in ways that are much more efficient and good than any central planner could figure out. So I would say that lots of people don't understand the difference between money and wealth. I would say that people view money as wealth rather than as a means of keeping score as to how much who owes whom. Would I go, okay, what is my idea of economics? What should the role of government be, if any? And where would I confine it? And would I go for anarchism as in no state? In small societies, I could see anarchism working. In small societies, I could see anarchism working really well. I mean, people naturally do tend to generate ladders. That's what the serotonin and the serotonergic system is for. But what I'm not particularly fond of is the idea that the ladder should be slicked down with oil by everybody wishing to climb up to a certain level. I don't think that should occur, and that's one of the biggest things that government does when involved in economics, is he who pays the piper calls the tune. And it's amazing how little you have to spend in campaign contributions in order to get the ear of a politician. I mean, you can, for a few $1,000s, get all sorts of political favors. And, for donating to somebody's charity, donating $1 million to somebody's charity could easily cause you to get $5 million in tax breaks. So, I would say that the role of the government in economics should be very minimal. If I think about the times that someone should be allowed to use force, which is essentially what the government does, right? You wind up having goons with guns that can show up and arrest you for doing something or not doing something. I just think of all the times that I would want something and think, okay, when would it be legitimate for me to use force? When would it be legitimate for me to point a gun at somebody and say, okay, back up, stop? I would say theft, fraud, murder, rape, those kinds of things, definitely. So the government could jail someone for theft or fraud, and I would be okay with a minarchist government doing that. In fact, I would hope that they would do that. But the idea that people somehow don't know what's good for themselves it's condescending to everybody. It's condescending to everybody. So that whole condescension thing is a little bit difficult for me to deal with. Simply because that attitude of condescension means that someone is trying to amass unto himself the ability to do central planning. But as things stand now, no, I'm not an anarchist, and no, I don't think I would be. I would be what is termed a minarchist, which is basically that government should fulfill a very minimal role, that of, for instance, national defense, and carrying the stick to stop people that are using force or fraud against other people in an aggressive, or even fraud in a defensive, but force in an aggressive way, and force or fraud against anybody. Or even non-commensurate force in defense, which, non-commensurate meaning I'm defending myself and I blow up your house with a nuclear bomb. Very, very disproportionate orders of magnitude difference. But anyhow, going back to the piece I was reading, it will at once be evident on this point, that is the point of central planning versus diffuse planning. The position will be different with respect to different kinds of knowledge, and the answer to our question will therefore largely turn on the relative importance of the different kinds of knowledge, those more likely to be at the disposal of particular individuals, and those which we should with greater confidence expect to find in the possession of an authority made up of suitably chosen experts. If it is today so widely assumed that the latter will be in a better position, this is because one kind of knowledge, namely scientific knowledge, occupies now so prominent a place in public imagination that we tend to forget that it's not the only kind that is relevant. It may be admitted that as far as scientific knowledge is concerned, a body of suitably chosen experts may be in the best position to command all the best knowledge available, though this is, of course, merely shifting the difficulty to the problem of selecting the experts. What I wish to point out is that, even assuming that this problem can be readily solved, it is only a small part of the wider problem. Today, it is almost heresy to suggest that scientific knowledge is not the sum of all knowledge. But a little reflection will show that there is beyond question a body of very important but unorganized knowledge which cannot possibly be called scientific in the sense of knowledge and general rules. The knowledge of the particular circumstances of time and place. It is with respect to this that practically every individual has some advantage over all others, because he possesses unique information of which beneficial use might be made, but of which use can be made only if the decisions depending on it are left to him, or are made with his active cooperation. We need to remember only how much we have to learn in any occupation after we've completed our theoretical training. How big a part of our working life we spend learning particular jobs, and how valuable an asset in all walks of life is knowledge of people, of local conditions, and of special circumstances. To know of and put to use a machine not fully employed, or somebody's skill which could be better utilized, or to be aware of a surplus stock which can be drawn upon during an interruption of supplies, is socially quite as useful as the knowledge of better alternative techniques. And the shipper who earns his living from using otherwise empty or half-filled journeys of tramp steamers, or the estate agent whose whole knowledge is almost exclusively one of temporary opportunities, or the arbitrager who gains from local differences of commodity prices, are all performing eminently useful functions based on special knowledge of circumstances of the fleeting moment not known to others. It is a curious fact that this sort of knowledge should today be generally regarded with a kind of contempt, and that anyone who by such knowledge gains an advantage over someone better equipped with theoretical or technical knowledge is thought to have acted almost disreputably. To gain an advantage from better knowledge of facilities of communication or transport is sometimes regarded as almost dishonest, although it is quite as important that society make use of the best opportunities in this respect as in using the latest scientific discoveries. This prejudice has in a considerable measure affected the attitude toward commerce in general compared with that toward production. Even economists who regard themselves as definitely immune to the crude materialist fallacies of the past constantly commit the same mistake where activities directed toward the acquisition of such practical knowledge are concerned, apparently because in their scheme of things all such knowledge is supposed to be given. A common idea now seems to be that all such knowledge should, as a matter of course, be readily at the command of everybody, and the reproach of irrationality leveled against the existing economic order is frequently based on the fact that it is not so available. This view disregards the fact that the method by which such knowledge can be made as widely available as possible is precisely the problem to which we have to find an answer. So how do you communicate this vast variety? So that leaves us with a question. How is information effectively communicated in an economy? Yes, and how does... Mhm. And how does the pricing mechanism work? How does that communicate information? And what does interfering with prices do? And I'm sorry if the character limit is a hindrance. Unfortunately, I can't do anything about that. Yeah, pricing is incredibly important. And pricing is incredibly important. Well, while people are typing, I'll just start talking a bit about pricing, but I'm not going to go and give away all the information. And in forms of abundance or scarcity, interfering with prices causes shortages and other Venezuela-like stuff. Yes. Yes. It does. So a high price would inform then of scarcity, and a low price would inform of abundance. Or a relatively high price or a relatively low price. And it's scarcity or abundance with respect to, I know I can put the O on my forehead again and call myself Captain Obvious. Scarcity or abundance with respect to what people want. Like, something isn't scarce if it's not desired. However little there may be, if people want less of it than what there is, then it's not scarce. If people want more of it than what there is, or as much as what there is, then it is scarce. And so if you interfere with prices, then people can't make wise decisions. Using the illustration of, okay, a hurricane hits a city, knocks out the power grid, sends a bunch of seawater into the streets and into the fresh water supply, cuts off or makes it incredibly difficult for food to reach there by normal means. Prices for all those things will go up. People want things more. And sometimes people put laws in place that say, oh, you are not allowed to raise the prices past the point where they were before the natural disaster hit. Well, what happens then? When you're someone who has a generator, then no longer is it a free transaction. No longer can people bid on a generator. Right? If I'm auctioning a generator in the middle of a bad situation, people will be willing to pay more for it because it'll be worth more to them. So if there's somebody, if the power grid is down and the price of a generator is $100, a bunch of people have $100 around, then those generators are all going to be gone based on who gets there first, as opposed to who's willing to pay the most. So that means the person who would derive the most value from a generator won't necessarily get it. Now, if there's a store owner that wants a generator to keep his freezers running, he might be willing to pay more than somebody who just wants it for, I don't know, watching TV or something. The same with water. So then people will just stockpile on water and sell it on the black market for higher prices. Whereas, even if a place is completely flooded or something, people will, if the prices go up high enough, people will from surrounding areas decide, oh, there is a demand for water and for generators and for all these other different kinds of things in the hurricane zone. Let's go and buy up a bunch of bottled water and generators and come and sell them. And the more people that come and sell them, the more they're going to have to compete on price. So if you can wait just a day or two for people to get the infrastructure in place, or to use existing infrastructure or what have you in order to bring resources, then you can wind up having resource allocation in accordance with how valuable something is to somebody. It's very, very simple stuff. You know, the shop owner should be the first person to get a generator. And if another person, let's say it's a life or death situation, that somebody be able to have dialysis, right? Well then, I mean, I would assume hospitals would be built with generators, but let's just say that the wing of the hospital needs a generator for some reason. Well, the hospital should then be able to go and buy the generator. But if you don't have the pricing, then you wind up relying on somebody else's judgment who can never quite weigh the value of a resource, of a scarce resource, to a bunch of different people, and winds up having to make some sort of an arbitrary decision that may or may not work. And will often, and because of the abundance of the decisions that can be made, will fail more often than it will succeed. So if you use price as a basis for making your decisions, and there's a free market, then by definition, you are making the best choice for you and for everybody else. I mean, I think it's very interesting that people go and they look and they say, oh, well, if I go and I buy this particular car, I can get this kind of a government tax credit. Like, what in the world is this crap? Or I can get a rebate, or I can go, if I buy a house, I can go and get $8,000 off the sticker price, paid for by Big Daddy government and so on. It's like, well, that interferes with the price, and that's making somebody else pay for my stuff. That's not moral, and that does a disservice to everybody. Does a disservice to everybody. I'm trying to think of an example here. I was in the middle of thinking until I started coughing. I can't do two things at once. I can't even think and cough at the same time. Yeah, central planning sucks. Oh yeah, I can think of this. Okay, so let's say, because I have spent very little money on cars in my lifetime. I'm talking very little. I've spent more money on oil changes than I have on cars. What does that mean? That means that the people from whom I bought the cars did not value the cars. I also bought cars and drove in such a way. I bought cars that get good gas mileage, and I drove in such a way as to get good gas mileage. So I bought cars and drove in such a way as to save money. You know, some people actually pay per pound. Right? If you buy something like a used F-150 or a used old Cadillac or something, that's another thought. I do capital expenditures plus fuel expenditures per unit distance driven, per mile or something, per kilometer. And I make the decision based solely upon price. And even with the fact that, we're dealing with a 400% tax on fuel over here in Finland or what have you, it still kind of leads you to the best decision, at least given the circumstances. And if you can go and see past the marketing, or you see past the lies, and just think of, okay, this is how much 1 mile driven will cost me on average in the life of this car, based on the best information I have, and this is how much a mile driven will cost me in that car, based on the best information I have. Well, if they're the same price, then they're essentially equivalent cars from a financial standpoint. But if they're not equivalent cars, or if the price is different, then there better be something compelling, very compelling, to the car that costs me more. Because I buy cars for the purpose of getting from A to B. I don't buy them as social status symbols. I think that's stupid. The only reason I would buy a car as a social status symbol is and fuel expenditures per mile makes sense. And that's why, I'm not going to be buying a new car. I'm not going to be buying a new car But I'm just using price signals. By definition, if a car is cheap, it is going to be a small new technologies. And I'm all a fan of R&D. The fact of the matter is, people aren't going to go and buy, or rather, no idea like an electric car, for instance, would catch on unless fossil fuels are actually way more scarce than what they are now. Because fossil fuels contain way more energy per unit mass than do batteries. And batteries are a huge, huge drain on the environment. Huge drain on the workforce. It costs much more to store energy in batteries than it does to store energy in fuel. In fossil fuels. So there is, if people want to innovate and do that on their own dime, then I'm perfectly fine with that. But I'm not going to be buying an electric car unless the electric car is more economical than the gasoline car or the diesel car. That is the way to know the general impact that you're having on the environment around you. And why am I going this environmentalist way? It's because so many people are willing to pay a premium for calling something green. Like, if you really are green, then you're going to go for the cheapest alternatives. If you are really green, you're going to go and count the cost and figure out what will be the least cost to you over time. And that could include the cost of cleaning up your environment. You think about, okay, how much is that worth to me? Well, then I guess I better budget for that. And you add up all the costs of something that you have, and the thing that winds up being cheaper, you decide. That is called being smart. That is also called being an environmentalist. That is called being prudent. That is called counting the cost. And you do that with some semblance of foresight as to the way things could potentially progress. And you think more than one step at a time. That means that buying a car could be a more complicated decision than just thinking, oh boy, this car makes me feel good. Buying anything could be a more complicated decision if you think about how to maximize the utility that it gives you over time. Prices are very, very important. So the lesson that I would have anyone learn is, don't buy stupid stuff you don't need with money you don't have. Do Greens really consider externalities that well? No, they consider feelings. The feeling of being green and paying a lot of money could conceivably be more important to them than the feeling of actually being green and paying less money. Well, anyhow, there's still, we've only gone through the first three sections of the essay, but it's time for the educational hour. We've been going for, unfortunately, the stream started a little bit late. I was recovering from a headache. The next thing that we have to talk about is education. We're going to talk about Ben Franklin. This is an essay by John Taylor Gatto. Ben Franklin was born on Milk Street, Boston, on January 17th, 1706. His father had 17 children. 4 died at birth, by 2 wives. Ben was the youngest. Josiah, the father, was a candle maker, not part of the gentry. His tombstone tells us he was without an estate or any gainful employment, which apparently means his trade didn't allow wealth to be amassed. But as the talkative tombstone continues, by constant labor and industry with God's blessing, they maintained a large family comfortably and brought up 13 children and 7 grandchildren reputably. Writing to his own son at the age of 65, Ben Franklin referred to his circumstances as poverty and obscurity, from which he rose to a state of affluence and to some degree reputation. The means he used so well succeeded he thought posterity might like to know what they were. Some, he believed, would find his example suitable to their own situations, and therefore fit to be imitated. At 12, he was bound apprentice to brother James, a printer. After a few years of that, and disliking his brother's authority, he ran away first to New York, and soon after to Philadelphia, where he arrived broke at the age of 17. Finding work as a printer proved easy, and through his sociable nature and ready curiosity he made acquaintance with men of means. One of these induced Franklin to go to London, where he found work as a compositor, and once again brought himself to the attention of men of substance. A merchant brought him back to Philadelphia in his early 20s, as what might today be called an administrative assistant or personal secretary. From this association, Franklin assembled means to set up his own printing house, which published a newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, to which he constantly contributed essays. At 26, he began to issue Poor Richard's Almanac, and for the next quarter century the almanac spread his fame through the colonies and in Europe. He involved himself deeper and deeper in public affairs. He designed an academy which was developed later into the University of Pennsylvania. He founded the American Philosophical Society as a crossroads of the sciences. He made serious researches into the nature of electricity and other scientific inquiries, carried on a large number of money-making activities, and involved himself heavily in politics. At the age of 42, he was wealthy. The year was 1748. In 1748, he sold his business in order to devote himself to study, and in a few years, scientific discoveries gave him a reputation with the learned of Europe. In politics, he reformed the postal system and began to represent the colonies in dealings with England, and later France. In 1757, he was sent to England to protest against the influence of the Penns in the government of Pennsylvania, and remained there 5 years, returning 2 years later to petition the king to take the government away from the Penns. He lobbied to repeal the Stamp Act. From 1767 to 1775, he spent much time traveling through France, speaking, writing, and making contacts, which resulted in a reputation so vast it brought loans and military assistance to the American rebels and finally crucial French intervention at Yorktown, which broke the back of the British. As a writer, politician, scientist, and businessman, Franklin had few equals among the educated of his day, though he left school at 10. He spent 9 years as American commissioner to France. In terms only of his ease with the French language, of which he had little until he was in his 60s, this unschooled man's accomplishments are unfathomable by modern pedagogical theory. In many of his social encounters with French nobility, this candlemaker's son held the fate of the new nation in his hands, because he and Jefferson were being weighed as emblems of America's ability to overthrow England. Franklin's autobiography is a trove of clues from which we can piece together the actual curriculum which produced an old man capable of birthing a nation. My elder brothers were all put apprentice to different trades. I was put to the grammar school at 8 years of age, my father intending to devote me as the tithe of his sons to the services of the Anglican Church. My early readiness in learning to read, which must have been very early, as I do not remember when I could not read, and the opinion of all his friends that I should be a good scholar encouraged him in this purpose. I continued, however, at grammar school not quite 1 year. Young Ben was yanked from grammar school and sent to another type, less ritzy and more nuts and bolts in colonial times, the writing and arithmetic school. There, under the tutelage of Mr. Brownell, an advocate of mild, encouraging methods, Franklin failed in arithmetic. At 10 years old, I was taken home to assist my father in his business. Accordingly, I was employed in cutting wick for candles, filling the dipping mold in the molds for cast candles, attending the shop, going on errands, etc. I disliked the trade, and had a strong inclination for the sea, but my father declared against it. There are other less flattering accounts why Franklin left both of these schools and struck out on his own at the age of 10. Elsewhere, he admits to being a leader of mischief, some of it mildly criminal, and to being corrected by his father. But causation is not our concern, only bare facts. Benjamin Franklin commenced school at 3rd grade age, and exited when he would have been in the 5th to become a tallow chandler's apprentice. A major part of Franklin's early education consisted of studying Father Josiah, who turns out himself to be a pretty fair example of education without schooling. He had an excellent constitution, very strong, ingenious, could draw prettily, skilled in music, a clear, pleasing voice, played psalm tunes on his violin, a mechanical genius, sound understanding, solid judgment in prudential matters, both private and public affairs. In the latter, indeed, he was never employed, the numerous family he had to educate in the straitness of his circumstances keeping him close to his grade. But I remember well his being frequently visited by leading people who consulted him for his opinion in affairs of the town or of the church, and showed a great deal of respect for his judgment and advice, frequently chosen an arbitrator between contending parties. We don't need to push too hard to see a variety of informal training laboratories incidentally offered in this father-son relationship, which had sufficient time to prove valuable in Franklin's own development. Opportunities that would have been hard to find in any school. Josiah drew, he sang, he played violin. This was a tallow chandler with sensitivity to those areas in which human beings are most human. He had an inventive nature, ingenious, which must have provided a constant example to Franklin that a solution can be crafted ad hoc to a problem if a man kept his nerve and had proper self-respect. His good sense, recognized by his neighbors who sought his judgment, was always within earshot of Ben. In this way the boy came to see the discovery process, various systems of judgment, the role of an active citizen who may become minister without portfolio simply by accepting responsibility for others and discharging that responsibility faithfully. At his table he liked to have as often as he could some sensible friend or neighbor to converse with, and always took care to start some ingenious or useful topic for discourse, which might tend to improve the minds of his children. By this means he turned our attention to what was good, just, and prudent in the conduct of life, and little or no notice was ever taken of what related to the victuals on the table. I was brought up in such perfect inattention to those matters as to be quite indifferent what kind of food was set before me. No course of instruction, or quality of homework, or quantity of homework, could deliver Franklin's facility with language. Only something like Josiah's incidental drills at the dinner table. We can see sharply through Franklin's memoir that a tallow chandler can indeed teach himself to speak to kings. And there were other themes in the family Franklin's educational armory besides arts. Home demonstrations, regular responsibility, being held to account, being allowed to overhear adults solving public and private problems, and constant infusions of good conversation. He sometimes took me to walk with him and see joiners, bricklayers, turners, braziers, etc. at their work, that he might observe my inclination and endeavor to fix it on some trade or another. It has ever since been a pleasure to me to see good workmen handle their tools, and it has been useful to me, having learnt so much by it as to be able to do little jobs myself. As it is for most members of a literate society, reading was the largest single element of Franklin's educational foundation. From a child I was fond of reading, and all the little money that came into my hands was ever laid out in books. Pleased with Pilgrim's Progress, my first collection was of John Bunyan's works in separate little volumes. I afterwards sold them to enable me to buy R. Burton's historical collections. They were small Chapman's books and cheap, 40 to 50 in all. My father's little library consisted chiefly of books in polemic divinity, most of which I read. Plutarch's Lives there was in which I read abundantly and still think that time spent to great advantage. There was also a book of Defoe's called An Essay on Projects, and another of Dr. Mather's called Essays to Do Good, which perhaps gave me a turn of thinking that had an influence on some of the principal future events in my life. You might well ask how young Franklin was reading Bunyan, Burton, Mather, Defoe, Plutarch, and works of polemic divinity before he would have been in junior high school. If you were schooled in the brain development lore of academic pedagogy, it might seem quite a tour de force. How do you suppose the son of a working man with 13 kids became such an effective public speaker that for more than half a century his voice was heard nationally and internationally on the great questions? He employed a method absolutely free. He argued with his friend Collins. Very fond we were of argument, and very desirous of confuting one another, which disputation's turn is based upon contradiction. Here Franklin warns against using dialectics on friendship or at social gatherings. I had caught it, the dialectical habit, by reading my father's books of dispute about religion. A question was started between Collins and me: the propriety of educating the female sex in learning and their abilities to study. He was of the opinion that it was improper. I took the contrary side. Shortly after he began arguing, he also began reading the most elegant periodical of the day, Addison's and Steele's Spectator. I thought the writing excellent and wished, if possible, to imitate it. With that in view, I took some of the papers, and making short hints of the sentiment in each sentence, laid them by a few days, and then, without looking at the book, tried to complete the papers again by expressing each hinted sentiment at length, and as fully as it had been expressed before, in any suitable words that should come to hand. Then I compared my Spectator with the original, discovered some of my faults, and corrected them. This method was hammered out while working a 60-hour week. In learning eloquence, there's only been his determination and the Spectator, no teacher. For instance, while executing rewrites, Franklin came to realize his vocabulary was too barren. I found I wanted a stock of words, which I thought I should have acquired before that time, if I had gone on making verses, since the continual occasion for words of the same import but of different length, to suit the measure, or of different sound for the rhyme, would have laid me under a constant necessity of searching for variety, and also have tended to fix that variety in my mind and make me master of it. As a good empiricist, he tried a home cure for this deficiency. I took some tales and turned them into verse, and after a time, when I had pretty well forgotten the prose, turned them back again. I also sometimes jumbled my collection of hints, his outline, into confusions, and after some weeks endeavored to reduce them into the best order, before I began to form the full sentences and complete the paper. This was to teach me method in the arrangement of thoughts. By comparing my work afterward with the original, I discovered many faults and amended them, but I sometimes thought I had been lucky enough to improve the method or the language. By the time he was 16, Franklin was ready to take up his deficiencies in earnest with full confidence he could by his own efforts overcome them. Here's how he handled that problem with arithmetic. Being on some occasion made ashamed of my ignorance in figures which I had twice failed in learning when at school, I took Crocker's Book of Arithmetic and went through the whole by myself with great ease. I also read Sellers and Shermy's Book of Navigation and became acquainted with the geometry they contain. This school dropout tells us he was also reading John Locke's essay concerning human understanding, as well as studying the arts of rhetoric and logic, particularly the Socratic method of disputation, which so charmed and intrigued him that he abruptly dropped his former argumentative style, putting on the mask of the humble inquirer and doubter. I found this method safest for myself, and very embarrassing to those against whom I used it. Therefore I took a delight in it, practiced it continually, and grew very artful and expert in drawing people, even of superior knowledge, into concessions, the consequences of which they did not foresee, entangling them in difficulties out of which they could not extricate themselves, and so obtaining victories that neither myself nor my cause always deserved. Might there be an instructive parallel between teaching a kid to drive, as my uncle taught me to do at age 11, and the incredible opportunities working-class kids like Franklin were given to develop as quickly and as far as their hearts and minds allowed? We drive, regardless of our intelligence or characters, because the economy demands it. In colonial America, through the early republic, a pressing need existed to get the most from everybody. Because of that need, unusual men and unusual women appeared in great numbers to briefly give the lie to traditional social order. In that historical instant, thousands of years of orthodox suppositions were shattered. In the words of Eric Hoffer, only here in America were common folk given a chance to show what they could do on their own, without a master to push and order them about. Franklin and Edison, multiplied many times, were the result. I would dare say that he is one of the great people in all of history. Franklin was a pretty amazing dude. I have a very high opinion of him. And I could only wish to emulate him far, far better than I already have. Indeed, it was because I knew these stories of days gone by when these sorts of things were commonplace for people to grow up early that I didn't see anything particularly unusual with going to college when I was 11 years old. It just seemed like the most natural thing in the world because I didn't have somebody slowing me down. Or rather, I did have somebody slowing me down. That was my mother. She didn't want me going. And so she delayed me 3 years. Or thereabouts. I didn't want to start going to college until I was 8. But I didn't get to go until I was 11, so... You see, rather than comparing going at the age of 18 or something, or 19 or whatever is the normal age of people going, I was comparing going at the age of 8. And looking at these things, I figure it's or at least it should be easy for people to get through a high school curriculum. It should be easy for people to get through a high school curriculum by the age of 13. Whoa. That was interesting. This is very interesting. So yeah, I think that people should be able to go. I have this theory that pretty much everyone, almost everyone, definitely average students, should be able to get through high school by the age of 13. If you begin school at the age of 7, my theory is that people should be able to do that pretty easily, based off of the level of the stuff that university studies are. And that people can much more efficiently go through the material that school gives them from a young age onward, if rather than drawing from the method of the pedagogues that are currently running things and currently in charge of institutionalized education, one were to substitute this drive and this pursuing things for their own sake or for the sake of what they can bring you. If you're going and learning something for you, you're going to know the thing. Whereas if you're going and learning something for a pedagogue, it's going to be less strong. I mean, I'm putting together some information, and it's actually a very loose collection of material for parents with the goal of teaching their children to be independent. And by teaching, I use that word very loosely too. I mean teaching more in the lines of coaching or enabling or generally allowing there to be a set of circumstances for someone to grow and providing the appropriate level of support within that framework. Okay, how old are you, tuberculosis, if I may ask? Feel free not to let me know if you don't want me to know, but you were saying you could do English and social sciences by 13, math and science probably 15 or 16 at best. Um, well, I don't necessarily take issue with that because I would say that the way that things are taught in school, the way math and science are taught in school, it's impossible to learn it fast. It's impossible to learn it fast. But, and I'm probably going to let I'll just let you guys know that I'm actually writing an app. Oh, you're 38. Are you Thomas? No, 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 no. Yes? No, maybe. I don't know. Anyhow, yeah, I have this theory that the teaching of math is done completely wrong. Because people don't understand how it works. Right? And I'm pretty terrible at doing math in a conventional way. Starting with arithmetic, lining up the numbers and working from right to left, I see that as pointless. Right? I've always added and subtracted from left to right. And that alone, yeah, I've always added and subtracted from left to right. And that alone has made doing quick calculations and coming to estimates and ideas of how things work a lot faster, because if you work from left to right, you literally start with, okay, so you start with the leftmost digit and then you go this way, boom, 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 one digit at a time. Well, once you get to a close enough answer, you're close enough. Then you can understand how a system works. And so that gives you more chance to thinking about the theory behind things once you get a general idea of the mathematical characterization of anything. Because I never had some moron teaching me how to do math from right to left. Well, actually, I did have one person trying to teach me how to do math from right to left, and I was just like, what in the world is this? What in the world is this sorcery? It's just horrible. And so I just discarded it completely. And I think that doing, you know, just little things like that, and then focusing on conceptual understanding, and then building things up in the real world by looking at how something works, is it's important. And making resources for doing this is what I'm devoting myself to. I'm hoping that, by bringing these things to the App Store and so on, and they're really, really simple things, people would be able to, in a matter of minutes to hours, learn what people are trying to teach in months to years. And I truly believe that it's possible to do that. Think about what homework does to somebody. All homework really does is signal that a teacher has the right to waste your time when you're at home. That's what homework signals. And if everyone is required to go at the speed of the very slowest person on a very bad day, then you wind up dumbing everybody down. And even the very slowest person on a very bad day is much more capable than people give him credit for. Because an awful lot of the slowness can also be due to unmotivation or lack of motivation. Doing English the way that Franklin did English, reading great works. There are readers like the McGuffey Reader that took you basically through being able to be better at English than most graduate students of English by the time that one would get through 5th grade. It wasn't unheard of. In fact, it was kind of the norm. So say you start at age 6 or 7. Basically, by the time you're 12, you have a perfectly adequate, at the very minimum, understanding of rhetoric and literature and English and so on. The math and science is more done on an exploratory basis. You learn your arithmetic and you can learn statistics too. Statistics are incredibly important because you then can figure out how people are lying to you. And you can also figure out how to properly represent your own data and how to use pictures and numbers and so on to communicate whatever it is that you're trying to communicate. How to go and assimilate a bunch of information and understand what's going on. All these things in order to get a better picture of the world around you. And if you're doing all this stuff with the purpose of producing and the purpose of coming up with a good picture of the world around you and a purpose of figuring out opportunities for yourself and for others that you care about, you will be more effective, by definition. But it involves a paradigm shift. It involves looking at the world a different way than most people are used to looking at the world. As a way that will, a lens that leads to success. So, with that said, we're going to have a little bit of an intermission here in the next couple minutes. I'm going to put a little screen up for you guys. In the meantime, we'll have, let's see, what's our usual intermission length? An 8-minute intermission. And I'll come back after having gotten a little something to drink so that hopefully I'll actually be able to talk. Look forward to seeing you guys on the other side, and thank you so much for tuning in already to this point. See you in approximately 8 minutes. Right, well, we're back. And do I have a treat for you? I, I don't know if there's any way for me to recommend listening to a speech at this moment more than I can at the commencement speech of Charlie Munger. I was watching it just yesterday, and I thought this is just. I don't agree with necessarily everything. I don't necessarily agree with everything said, but many of the points he makes are so very good and profound that I thought to share them with you guys. I thought that it might be one of the most good and illuminating pieces that I could conceivably offer. That I could just point to and say, look at what this guy says. This stuff is good. So, with that said, I'm really looking forward to watching this video with you.
Well, no doubt many of you are wondering why the speaker is so old. Well, the answer is obvious: he hasn't died yet. And why was the speaker chosen? Well, I don't know that either. I like to think that the development department had nothing to do with it. Whatever the reason, I think it's very fitting that I'm sitting here, because I see one crowd of faces in the rear not wearing robes, and I know from having educated an army of descendants who really deserves a lot of the honors that are being given to the people up here in front. The sacrifice and the wisdom and the value transfer that comes from one generation to the next can never be underrated. And that gave me enormous pleasure as I looked at this sea of Asian faces to my left. All my life I've admired Confucius. I like the idea of filial piety, the idea that there are values that are taught and duties that come naturally, and that all that should be passed on to the next generation. And you people who don't think there's anything in this idea, please note how fast these Asian faces are rising in American life. I think they have something. All right, I scratched out a few notes, and I'm going to try and just give an account of some ideas and attitudes that have worked well for me. I don't claim that they're perfect for everybody, although I think many of them are pretty close to universal values, and many of them are can't-fail ideas. What are the core ideas that have helped me? Well, luckily, I got at a very early age the idea that the safest way to try and get what you want is to try and deserve what you want. It's such a simple idea. It's the golden rule, so to speak. You want to deliver to the world what you would buy if you were on the other end. There is no ethos, in my opinion, that is better for any lawyer or any other person to have. By and large, the people who've had this ethos win in life, and they don't win just money, just honors and emoluments. They win the respect, the deserved trust of the people they deal with. And there is huge pleasure in life to be obtained from getting deserved trust. And the way to get it is to deliver what you'd want to buy if the circumstances were reversed. Now, occasionally you find a perfect rogue of a person who dies rich and and widely known. But mostly these people are fully understood by the surrounding civilization. And when the cathedral is full of people at the funeral ceremony, most of them are there to celebrate the fact that the person is dead. And that reminds me of the story of the time when one of these people died and the minister said, "It's now time for someone to say something nice about the deceased." And nobody came forward. And nobody came forward. And nobody came forward. And finally one man came up and he said, "Well, his brother was worse." That is not where you want to go. That's not the kind of funeral you want to have. You'll leave entirely the wrong example. A second idea that I got very early was that there's no love that's so right as admiration-based love, and that love should include the instructive dead. Somehow I got that idea, and I've lived with it all my life, and it's been very, very useful to me. A love like that celebrated by Somerset Maugham in his book of Human Bondage, that's a sick kind of love. It's a disease. And if you find yourself in a disease like that, my advice to you is turn around and fix it, eliminate it. Another idea that I got, and this may remind you of Confucius too, is that wisdom acquisition was a moral duty. It's not something you do just to advance in life. Wisdom acquisition is a moral duty. And there's a corollary to that proposition, which is very important. It means that you're hooked for lifetime learning. And without lifetime learning, you people are not going to do very well. You are not going to get very far in life based on what you already know. You're going to advance in life by what you're going to learn after you leave here. If you take Berkshire Hathaway, which is certainly one of the best regarded corporations in the world, and it may have the best long-term investment record in the entire history of civilization. The skill that got Berkshire through one decade would not have sufficed to get it through the next decade with the achievements made. Without Warren Buffett being a learning machine, continuous learning machine, the record would have been absolutely impossible. The same is true at lower walks of life. I constantly see people rise in life who were not the smartest, sometimes not even the most diligent, but they are learning machines. They go to bed every night a little wiser than they were when they got up. And boy, does that habit help, particularly when you have a long run ahead of you. Alfred North Whitehead said at one time that the rapid advance of civilization came only when man invented the method of invention. And of course he was referring to the huge growth in GDP per capita and all the other good things that we now take for granted, which started a few hundred years ago, and when before that all was stasis. And so if civilization can progress only when it invents the method of invention, you can progress only when you learn the method of learning. I was very lucky. I came to law school having learned the method of learning. And nothing has served me better in my long life than continuous learning. And if you take Warren Buffett, if you watched him with a time clock, I would say half of all the time that he spends is just sitting on his ass and reading. And a big chunk of the rest of the time is spent talking one-on-one, either on the telephone or personally, with highly gifted people whom he trusts and who trust him. In other words, it looks quite academic, all this worldly success. academia has many wonderful values in it. I came across such a value not too long ago. Well, it was several years ago. When in my capacity as a hospital board chairman, I was dealing with a medical school academic. And this man, over years of hard work, had made himself know more about bone tumor pathology than almost anybody else in the world. And he wanted to pass this knowledge on to the rest of us, and particularly the people that treat cancer, bone cancer. And how was he going to do it? Well, he decided to write a textbook that would be very useful to other people. Now, I don't think a textbook like this sells 2,000 copies, but those 2,000 copies are in all the major cancer centers of the world. He took a year's sabbatical, and he sat down at his computer, and he had all the slides because he'd saved them and organized them and filed them. And he worked 17 hours a day, 7 days a week, for a year. That was his sabbatical. At the end of the year, he had one of the great bone tumor pathology textbooks of the world. When you're around values like that, you want to pick up as much as you can. Another idea that was hugely useful to me was that I listened in law school when some wag said, a legal mind is a mind that when two things are all twisted up together and interacting, it's feasible to think responsibly about one thing and not the other. Well, I could see from that one sentence that that was perfectly ridiculous, and it pushed me further into my natural drift, which was into learning all the big ideas and all the big disciplines, so I wouldn't be a perfect damn fool who was trying to think about one aspect of something that couldn't be removed from the totality of the situation in a constructive fashion. And what I noted, since the really big ideas carry 95% of the freight, that it wasn't at all hard for me to pick up all the big ideas in all the disciplines and make them a standard part of my mental routines. Once you have the ideas, of course, they're no good if you don't practice. If you don't practice, you lose it. So I went through life constantly practicing this multidisciplinary approach. Well, I can't tell you what that's done for me. It's made life more fun. It's made me more constructive. It's made me more helpful to others. It's made me enormously rich. You name it, that attitude really helps. Now, there are dangers in it because it works so well that if you do it, you will frequently find you're sitting in the presence of some other expert, maybe even an expert that's superior to you, supervising you. And you will know more than he does about his own specialty, a lot more. You'll see the correct answer when he's missed it. That is a very dangerous position to be in. You can cause enormous offense by helpfully being right in a way that causes somebody else to lose face. And I never found a perfect way to solve that problem. I was a great poker player when I was young, but I wasn't a good enough poker player, so the people failed to sense that I thought I knew more than they did about their subjects, and it gave a lot of offense. Now I'm just regarded as eccentric, but there was a difficult period to go through. And my advice to you is to learn sometimes to keep your light under a bushel. One of my colleagues, also a number one in his class in law school, a great success in life, clerk for the Supreme Court, etc. But he knew a lot, and he tended to show it as a very young lawyer. And one day, the senior partner he was working under called him in and said, "Listen, Chuck," he says, "I want to explain something to you." He says, "Your duty under any circumstances is to behave in such a way that the client thinks he's the smartest person in the world, And you've got any little energy or insight available after that, use it to make your senior partner look like the smartest person in the world. And only after you've satisfied those two obligations do you want your light to shine at all. Well, that may have been very good advice for rising in a large firm. It wasn't what I did. I always obeyed the drift of my nature, and if other people didn't like it, well, I didn't need to be adored by everybody. Another idea, and by the way, when I talk about this multidisciplinary attitude, I'm really following a very key idea of the greatest lawyer of antiquity, Marcus Tullus Cicero. And Cicero is famous for saying, a man who doesn't know what happened before he's born goes through life like a child. Now, that is a very correct idea of Cicero's, and he's right to ridicule somebody so foolish as not to know what happened before he was born. But if you generalize Cicero, as I think one should, there are all these other things that you should know in addition to history. And those other things are the big ideas in all the other disciplines. And it doesn't help you just to know them enough so you could prattle them back on an exam and get an A. You have to learn these things in such a way that they're in a mental lattice work in your head and you automatically use them for the rest of your life. If you do that, I solemnly promise you that one day you'll be walking down the street and you'll look to your right and left and you'll think, my heavenly days, I'm now one of the few most competent people of my whole age cohort. If you don't do it, many of the brightest of you will live in the middle ranks or in the shallows. Another idea that I got, and it was encapsulated by that story the dean recounted about the man who wanted to know where he was going to die and he wouldn't go there. That rustic who had that idea had a profound truth in his hand. The way complex adaptive systems work and the way mental constructs work, problems frequently get easy. I'd even say usually are easier to solve if you turn them around in reverse. In other words, if you want to help India, the question you should ask is now, how can I help India? You think, what's doing the worst damage in India? What will automatically do the worst damage, and how do I avoid it? You'd think they're logically the same thing. They're not. Those of you who have mastered algebra know that inversion frequently will solve problems which nothing else will solve. And in life, unless you're more gifted than Einstein, inversion will help you solve problems that you can't solve another way. Let me use a little inversion now. What will really fail in life? What do we want to avoid? Such an easy answer. Sloth and unreliability. If you're unreliable, it doesn't matter what your virtues are. You're going to crater immediately. So doing what you have faithfully engaged to do should be an automatic part of your conduct. You want to avoid sloth and unreliability. Another thing I think should be avoided is extremely intense ideology, because it cabbages up one's mind. You've seen that, and you see a lot of it, in TV preachers, for instance. They've all got different ideas about theology, and a lot of them have minds that are made of cabbage, but that can happen with political ideology. And if you're young, it's easy to drift into loyalties. And when you announce that you're a loyal member and you start shouting the orthodox ideology out, what you're doing is pounding it in. And you're gradually ruining your mind. So you want to be very, very careful with this ideology. It's a big danger. In my mind, I've got a little example I use whenever I think about ideology, and that's the Scandinavian canoeists who succeeded in taming all the rapids of Scandinavia, and they thought they would tackle the whirlpools of the Erin Rapids here in the United States. The death rate was 100%. A big whirlpool is not something you want to go into. And I think the same is true about a really deep ideology. I have what I call an iron prescription that helps me keep sane when I naturally drift toward preferring one ideology over another. And that is, I say, I'm not entitled to have an opinion on this subject unless I can state the arguments against my position better than the people do who are supporting it. I think only when I've reached that state am I qualified to speak. Now you can say that's too much of an iron discipline. It's not too much of an iron discipline. It isn't even that hard to do. It sounds a lot like the iron prescription of Ferdinand the Great. It's not necessary to hope in order to persevere. That probably is too tough for most people. I don't think it's too tough for me, but it's too tough for most people. But this business of not drifting into the extreme ideology is a very, very important thing in life. If you want to have more correct knowledge and be wiser than other people, the heavy ideology is very likely to do you in. Another thing, of course, that does one in is the self-serving bias to which we're all subject. You think the true little me is entitled to do what it wants to do. And, for instance, why shouldn't the true little me overspend my income? Well, there once was a man who became the most famous composer in the world, but he was utterly miserable most of the time. And one of the reasons was he always overspent his income. That was Mozart. If Mozart can't get by with this kind of asinine conduct, I don't think you should try it. Generally speaking, envy, resentment, revenge, and self-pity are disastrous modes of thoughts. Self-pity gets pretty close to paranoia, and paranoia is one of the very hardest things to reverse. You do not want to drift into self-pity. I have a friend who carried a big stack of Lenin cards, about this thick, and when somebody would make a comment that reflected self-pity, he would take out one of the cards, take the top one off the stack, and hand it to the person. And the card said, "Your story has touched my heart. Never have I heard of anyone with as many misfortunes as you." Well, you can say that's waggery, but I suggest that every time you find you're drifting into self-pity, and I don't care what the cause, your child can be dying of cancer, self-pity is not going to improve the situation. Just give yourself one of those cards. It's a ridiculous way to behave. And when you avoid it, you get a great advantage over everybody else, almost everybody else, because self-pity is a standard condition. And yet you can train yourself out of it. And of course, the self-serving bias, you want to get out of yourself. Thinking that what's good for you is good for the wider civilization, and rationalizing all these ridiculous conclusions based on this subconscious tendency to serve oneself it's a terribly inaccurate way to think. And of course you want to drive that out of yourself because you want to be wise, not foolish. You also have to allow for the self-serving bias of everybody else, because most people are not going to remove it all that successfully, the human condition being what it is. And if you don't allow for self-serving bias in your conduct, again, you're a fool. You just aren't competent. I watched the brilliant Harvard Law Review trained general counsel of Solomon lose his career. And what he did was, when the CEO was aware that some underling had done something wrong, the general counsel said, "Gee, we don't have any legal duty to report this, but I think it's what we should do. It's our moral duty." And the general counsel was totally correct. But of course, it didn't work. It was a very unpleasant thing for the CEO to do, and he put it off and put it off and put it off. And in due course, why the thing eroded into a major scandal, and down went the CEO and the general counsel with him. The correct answer in situations like that was given by Ben Franklin. He says, if you would persuade, appeal to interest, not to reason. The self-serving bias is so extreme. If the general counsel said, look, this can erupt in something that will destroy you, take away your money, take away your status, it's a perfect disaster, it would have worked. You want to appeal to interest. You want to do it with lofty motives, but you should not avoid appealing to interest. Another thing, perverse incentives. You don't want to be in a perverse incentive system that's causing you to behave more and more foolishly or worse and worse. Incentives are too powerful a controller of human cognition and human behavior. And one of the things you're going to find in some modern law firms is billable hour quotas. And I could not have lived under a billable hour quota of 2,400 hours a year. That would have caused huge problems for me. I wouldn't have done it. And I don't have a solution for that for you. You'll have to figure it out for yourself. But it's a significant problem. Perverse associations also to be avoided. And you particularly want to avoid working directly under somebody you really don't admire and don't want to be like. It's very dangerous. We're all subject to control to some extent by authority figures, particularly authority figures that are rewarding us. And that requires some talent. The way I solved that is I figured out the people I did admire, and I maneuvered cleverly without criticizing anybody. So I was working entirely under people I admired. And a lot of law firms will permit that if you're shrewd enough to work it out. And your outcome in life will be way more satisfactory and way better if you work under people you really admire. The alternative is not a good idea. Objectivity maintenance. Well, we all remember that Darwin paid special attention to disconfirming evidence, particularly when it disconfirmed something he believed and loved. Well, objectivity maintenance routines are totally required in life if you're going to be a correct thinker. And there we're talking about Darwin's attitude, special attention to the disconfirming evidence, and also to checklist routines. Checklist routines avoid a lot of errors. You should have all this elementary wisdom, and then you should go through a mental checklist in order to use it. There is no other procedure that will work as well. A last idea that I found very important is I realized very early that non-egality would work better in the parts of the world I wanted to inhabit. What do I mean by non-egality? I mean John Wooden, when he was the #1 basketball coach in the world, he just said to the bottom 5 players, you don't get to play your sparring partners. The top 7 did all the playing. Well, the top 7 learned more, remember the learning machine, because they were doing all the playing. And when he got to that system, why, Wooden won more than he'd ever won before. I think the game of life, in many respects, is getting a lot of practice into the hands of the people that have the most aptitude to learn and the most tendency to be learning machines. And if you want the very highest reaches of human civilization, that's where you have to go. You do not want to choose a brain surgeon from your child among 50 applicants, all of whom just take turns doing the procedure. You know, that's not the way to get the really important. You know, your airplane's designed that way. You don't want your Berkshire Hathaways run that way. You want to get the power into the right people. I frequently tell the story of Max Planck when he won the Nobel Prize and went around Germany giving lectures on quantum mechanics. And the chauffeur gradually memorized the lecture, and he said, "Would you mind, Professor Planck, just because it's so boring to stay on our routines, would you mind if I gave the lecture this time and you just sat in front, my chauffeur sat?" And Planck said, "Sure," and the chauffeur got up and he gave this long lecture on quantum mechanics, and after which a physics professor stood up in the rear and asked a perfectly ghastly question. And the chauffeur said, "Well," he says, "I'm surprised that in an advanced city like Munich I get such an elementary question. I'm going to ask my chauffeur to reply." Well, the reason I tell that story is not entirely to celebrate the quick-wittedness of the protagonist. In this world, we have two kinds of knowledge. One is Planck knowledge, the people who really know. They've paid the dues, they have the aptitude. And then we got chauffeur knowledge. They have learned to prattle the talk. And they have a big head of hair, they may have fine timbre in the voice, they make a hell of an impression. But in the end, they've got chauffeur knowledge. I think I've just described practically every politician in the United States. And you're going to have the problem in your life of getting the responsibility into the people with the Planck knowledge and away from the people who have the chauffeur knowledge. And there are huge forces working against you. My generation has failed you to some extent. We are delivering to you in California a legislature where only the certified nuts from the left and the certified nuts from the right are allowed to serve, and none of them are removable. That's what my generation has done for you. But you wouldn't like it to be too easy, would you? Another thing that I found is that an intense interest in the subject is indispensable if you're really going to excel in it. I could force myself to be fairly good in a lot of things, but I couldn't be really good in anything where I didn't have an intense interest. So to some extent, you're going to have to follow me in, if at all feasible, you want to drift into doing something in which you have a natural interest. Another thing you have to do, of course, is have a lot of assiduity. I like that word because it means sit down on your ass until you do it. And I've had marvelous partners all my life. I think I got them partly because I tried to deserve them, and partly because I was wise enough to select them, and partly maybe there was some luck. But two partners that I chose for one little phase of my life had the following rule when they created a little design build construction team. They sat down and said, two-man partnership, divide everything equally. Here's the rule. Whenever we're behind in our commitments to other people, we will both work 14 hours a day until we're caught up. Well, needless to say, that firm didn't fail. The people died honored and rich. It's such a simple idea. It's such a simple idea. Another thing, of course, is life will have terrible blows in it. Horrible blows. Unfair blows. Doesn't matter. And some people recover and others don't. And there, I think the attitude of Epictetus is the best. He thought that every mischance in life was an opportunity to behave well. Every mischance in life was an opportunity to learn something. And that your duty was not to be submerged in self-pity, but to utilize the terrible blow in a constructive fashion. That is a very good idea. And you may remember the epitaph which Epictetus left for himself. It said, "Here lies Epictetus, a slave, maimed in body, and the ultimate in poverty and favored of the gods." Well, that's the way Epictetus is now remembered. He's had big consequences. And he was favored of the gods. He was favored because he became wise, and he became manly. Very good idea. I've got a final little idea, because I'm all for prudence as well as opportunism. My grandfather was the only federal judge in his city for nearly 40 years, and I really admired him. I'm his namesake. And I'm Confucian enough that even now I sit here and I'm saying, well, Judge Munger would be pleased to see me here. So I'm Confucian enough all these years after my grandfather is dead to carry the torch for my grandfather's values. And Grandfather Munger was a federal judge at a time, and there were no pensions for widows of federal judges. So he didn't save from his income, my grandmother would have been in penury. And being the kind of man he was, he underspent his income all his life and left her in comfortable circumstances. Along the way, in the 30s, my uncle's bank failed and couldn't reopen. And my grandfather saved the bank by taking over a third of his assets, good assets, and putting them into the bank and taking the horrible assets in exchange. And of course, it did save the bank. And while my grandfather took a loss, he got most of his money back eventually. But I've always remembered the example. And so when I got to college and I came across Houseman, I remembered a little poem from Houseman, and it went something like this. The thoughts of others were light and fleeting, of lovers meeting, luck or fame. Mine were of trouble and mine were steady, and I was ready when trouble came. You can say, who wants to go through life anticipating trouble? Well, I did. All my life I've gone through life anticipating trouble. Here I am well along in my 84th year, and like Epictetus, I've had a favored life. It didn't make me unhappy to anticipate trouble all the time and be ready to perform adequately if trouble came. It didn't hurt me at all. In fact, it helped me. So I quit claim to you, Houseman and Judge Munger. The last idea that I want to give to you as you go out into a profession that is frequently puts a lot of procedure and a lot of precautions and a lot of mumbo jumbo into what it does. This is not the highest form which civilization can reach. The highest form that civilization can reach is a seamless web of deserved trust. Not much procedure, just totally reliable people correctly trusting one another. That's the way an operating room works at the Mayo Clinic. If a bunch of lawyers were to introduce a lot of process, the patients would all die. So never forget, when you're a lawyer, that you may be sold for selling this stuff, but you don't have to buy it. You may be rewarded for selling it, but you don't have to buy it. In your own life, what you want is a seamless web of deserved trust. And if your proposed marriage contract has 47 pages, my suggestion is you not enter. Well, that's enough for one graduation. I hope these ruminations of an old man are useful to you. In the end, I'm like Old Valiant for Truth in Pilgrim's Progress. My sword I leave to him who can wear it.
You get sick for a minute.
you hear me now? Okay. Hopefully this works now. Is it possible for you to hear me? Okay, good. Well, now I guess I'm going to have some editing to do before I go and I make this particular piece public, because there's going to be that, I don't know, a clip of how long with no audio. But I was just saying that it'd be very nice to hear your guys' thought about Charlie Munger's commencement address, and then also saying a few things that I had thought about. I said, and what I said to begin this was, I'll just start talking and tell you my thoughts, so that you guys have a chance to collect your thoughts and write them. I don't know how many characters at a time into the YouTube chat. Um, and my first thought was, I thought it was really nice. Your story has touched my heart. Never before have I come across a person with more trouble than you. And having a stack of cards of that kind to give away. I thought that was a really cool idea, because and being willing to give those cards to yourself, it sets an idea that, okay, in my presence, in my sphere of influence, pity parties are not going to be a thing. And it helps inculcate the right kind of attitude, so I like that. And the other point that I was going to say was about the letting one's light shine or not. Learn to hide it under a bushel kind of a thing. And I discovered that, well, and I'll be the first to admit that I'm terrible at doing it. I'm absolutely terrible at doing this, or at least I have been my whole life, and I'm trying to get better at it. But then, if there is something that I have to offer that is greater than something that some expert in a field might have, finding a way to frame it in terms of the other person's interest, always, and always bringing the conversation back to them, works. Because then, even if you are intellectually superior in some sort of a way, at least you're demonstrating deference to them in some other way. And so you don't hijack the serotonin system nearly as much. And then people realize that you're actually not out to get them. People realize that you're not out to get them. People realize that you're there for the purpose of trying to bring value both to your lives and to the lives of other people. Because ultimately, the only reason, even if you're doing it from purely selfish motives, the only way that you're going to bring value to yourself in this current economy is by either directly producing that value for yourself or producing value for others, and then taking whatever they have to exchange in return. But because so many people are so very emotional, that needs to be at the forefront. The value proposition, the what is it that I am giving you? What is it that I am serving you with? What is it that I'm trying to provide to you? Now, in the case of this stream, I am trying to provide to you, or at least to perpetuate something that you may have already been looking at your whole life, or maybe not. But I'm trying to give a different way of looking at the world than what it is that people generally tout as the way to success. You know, this whole old story of go to grade school, get good grades, go to high school, get good grades, go to college, get good grades, get a job, and that is your ticket to success, isn't necessarily going to work. There are these things like lifelong learning, learning how to learn, and then also some information that is difficult to find unless you know where to look. I try to kind of bring these interesting things into the picture so that hopefully, in the midst of all the things that are said, you might have a gem or two to take away that can impact your life positively and perhaps the lives of those in your social circles. Like the ideas of autodidacy, teaching yourself, self-directed learning, all of these lovely things um, are ideas that I would like to be able to inculcate within viewership of this stream, within you, because I have evidence that it works. I have evidence that it is good. And when combining that attitude of persistence, that attitude of pressing forward through everything, that attitude of constant learning and constantly rising up to the challenges that life brings, and then, you know, some little bits of information here and there, some resources here and there that might get you started off on a path that you might not have seen before. Those are the things I dare say live for giving other people. I want to be an enabler, and I prefer being an enabler to almost any other role because it gives me the opportunity to dabble in all sorts of things. It gives me the opportunity to learn about all sorts of different things. If I wind up getting involved in all different sorts of people's businesses in all sorts of different realms, then I get the benefit of the experience of everybody, and I get the benefit of sharing said benefits with other people in order to help everyone be more constructive. I prefer taking a more backseat role. Yes, there are lots of things that I wind up doing for myself, but I really do prefer taking a backseat role in other people's projects and being there to help when the opportunity arises. Kind of like Ben Franklin's dad. I want to be remembered for something. I want to be remembered for being able to have a hand in helping other people become great. Whether that be my children, whether that be the people that I teach, whether that be the people that watch the stream. That's my goal. That's my value proposition to you. I figure that eventually, if I wind up providing enough value to other people, it'll come back. And if I'm not providing value, well, then people will know. I'm interested in knowing, what are your thoughts? Like, what sorts of things could I provide that would be of value to you? I mean, I'm doing this stream 4 days a week just for the purpose of having a repository of all this kind of stuff. And it may or may not be good, but it's stuff that I see as valuable. But I would like to be able to produce for you guys something that you see as valuable too. Well, if you guys want to answer, you can. If you don't, then, well, you don't have to. But here in these last few minutes, I figured on bringing something a little more funny and lighthearted. This was a an honorable mention for the Darwin Awards. If you guys aren't familiar with, okay, if you guys aren't too familiar with what Darwin Awards are, they're essentially these tongue-in-cheek awards given to people who take themselves out of the gene pool either by killing or castrating themselves. And then honorable mentions are people that didn't kill or castrate themselves, but were things to have gone a little bit differently, it could have happened. There's Lawn Chair Larry, so Larry Walters. He's one of the few to contend for the Darwin Awards and live to tell the tale. "I have fulfilled my 20-year dream," said Walters, a former truck driver for a company that makes TV commercials. "I'm staying on the ground. I've proved the thing works." Larry's boyhood dream was to fly, but fates conspired to keep him from his dream. He joined the Air Force, but his poor eyesight disqualified him from the job of pilot. After he was discharged from the military, he sat in his backyard watching jets fly overhead. He hatched his weather balloon scheme while sitting outside in his extremely comfortable Sears lawn chair. He purchased 45 weather balloons from an Army-Navy surplus store, tied them to his tethered lawn chair, dubbed the Inspiration 1, and filled the 4-foot diameter balloons with helium. Then, armed with some sandwiches, Miller Lite, and a pellet gun, he strapped himself into his lawn chair. He figured he would shoot to pop a few of the many balloons when it was time to descend. Larry planned to sever the anchor and lazily float to a height of about 30 feet above the backyard, where he would enjoy a few hours of flight before coming back down. But things didn't work out quite as Larry planned. When his friends cut the cord anchoring the lawn chair to his Jeep, he did not float lazily up to 30 feet. Instead, he streaked into the LA sky as if shot from a cannon, pulled by the lift of 45 helium balloons, holding 33 cubic feet of helium each. He didn't level off at 100 feet, nor did he level off at 1,000. After climbing and climbing, he leveled off at 16,000 feet. At that height, he felt he couldn't risk shooting any of the balloons lest he unbalance the load and really find himself in trouble. So he stayed there, drifting cold and frightened with his beer and sandwiches for more than 14 hours. He crossed the primary approach corridor of LAX, where startled Transworld Airlines and Delta Airlines pilots radioed in reports of the strange sight. Eventually, he gathered the nerve to shoot a few balloons and slowly descended. The hanging tethers tangled and caught in a power line, blacking out a Long Beach neighborhood for 20 minutes. Larry climbed to safety, where he was arrested by waiting members of the LAPD. As he was led away in handcuffs, a reporter dispatched to cover the daring rescue asked him why he had done it. Larry replied nonchalantly, "A man can't just sit around." The FAA was not amused. Safety Inspector Neil Savoy said, "We know he broke some part of the Federal Aviation Act, and as soon as we decide which part it is, a charge will be filed." And I'll share with you guys, if I can find it, a picture of Lawn Chair Larry. Here we go. There you go. That is the picture of our lovely protagonist. That is the picture of our lovely protagonist. There he is in his Sears lawn chair with 45, or probably no longer 45, weather balloons. Unless it was a picture taken at the very beginning, before they unsevered his tether. All right. So that's that. So we have 5 minutes left, and I'll say, let's just use this for chilling. If you have anything you want to say, I'll respond to it. Yes, and I'm reading the lawn chair story, Caleb. How? Was this a run through the park, or was that... Well, thanks, Caleb. Did you run into the Kung Fu dude? Yeah, next time I'm going to read a story that involves Canadians and a bull. That was a very... Canadians, alcohol, and a bull. If I recall that story correctly, that was a hilarious one. You ran and walked the same half mile back with something you were named after. Oh, yes. So how does Canadian drinking culture compare with Finland? Or Finnish drinking culture? Finnish drinking culture is people being completely antisocial until they get smashed, in which case they finally feel free to share things with other people. Now, they drink, but they do not eat. So they get to be blackout drunk pretty easily and wind up doing all sorts of stupid things that they then regret. I've noticed it's a little bit different compared to US drinking culture, in which beer and wings, for instance, is a thing, so you wind up having an awful lot of the effects of alcohol ameliorated by protein. And by not having any tanks in blood sugar due to the influx of insulin. But I don't know too much about Canadian drinking culture, except for the fact that there are lots of hilarious stories told, or that I've heard, about it. But I don't know too much about Canadian drinking culture. I just... the generally the same as in US and urban areas. Okay. Oh boy, the US bars and grills and things like that around here are nuts. Because you just take a look in there and you know that this is not US style. It's what people imagine the United States to be. Heck, I should probably just go dress myself up in a cowboy hat and some boots and offer to go and do bartending or something. There's one drink, Jack and Coke, and another one, Budweiser or something. I don't know. But anyhow, it's getting to be about that time. Thanks, guys, for tuning in. And if you have any feedback that you'd like to give, well, I'll give you guys my my email address at the risk that people can spam me. I'll let people spam me. And if you have any thoughts, any feedback, anything that you'd like to bring up, anything you'd like to connect with me on, then please do bring it up. If you would like me to consult or do anything like that for you, I'm completely willing. If it's a field that I have some expertise in. If it has to do with just general saying hi and so on, I welcome all those kinds of opportunities to interact. I may be an introvert, but I actually I'm trying to get out of my shell, and I really do appreciate when we can have mutually agreeable and beneficial relationships that are predicated upon dealing with each other respectfully. Anyhow, it is now 7 o'clock in the morning where I'm at, midnight where Caleb's at, so unfortunately now it's time to say goodbye, and see you again tomorrow, same time, 9 p.m. Eastern Time through 12 a.m. Tomorrow, which would be Wednesday for you, Thursday for me. Alright, talk to you later.